If you're a fan of American Horror Story, you may know that each season is inspired by true people and places. And Season 3 Coven is no different. Today we're talking about the infamous New Orleans socialite, serial killer, and torturer, Madam Delphine LaLaurie. Before we dive in, if you're a fan of this series and my content, please do me a favor and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Within her elaborate mansion, Delphine would host decadent parties for society's top socialites. Dressed in elaborate gowns, she would strut from room to room as her guests were drinking the finest champagnes, laughing and dancing. Meanwhile, hidden in plain sight above them all was a torture chamber, filled with slaves who were brutally disfigured and mutilated. They were either chained to the walls or suspended from chains hanging from the ceiling. The door to this room had a lock that was over 7 inches in diameter, while all the windows were bolted with thick iron shutters. And it was clear that the slaves in her possession continued to die. From 1830 to 1834, funeral records document that at least 12 of her slaves died, and the cause of death was unknown since during this time these deaths were not investigated. Although it didn't take long until the socialites who attended her parties began to hear rumors of torture. And over time, the rumors of torture began to circulate through high society, to the point that local authorities who did not typically get involved with the treatment of people's slaves did get involved. So they send a lawyer to her mansion to investigate. While on site, he searches the home and would report that nothing is out of the ordinary. In fact, he would include in his report that he was angered that anybody would even suspect this kind woman Delphine of even being capable of doing these things. Although we now know that aside from being a powerful and wealthy woman, Delphine was also a master manipulator. Shortly after the lawyer's visit, a neighbor would report that she witnessed Delphine chasing a young girl around the property, and that the girl, who appeared to be around 12 years old, was so terrified by Delphine, who had a whip in her hand, that she jumped onto a portion of the mansion's roof. As she looks back at Delphine, she loses her footing and falls from the roof to the ground and dies. Delphine clearly would not report this. She would try to cover up the death. Given horrific situations like this, it didn't take long until members of high society again began to talk about the violence and cruelty that Delphine was inflicting on her slaves. So again, officials send somebody out to the mansion, and this time, thankfully, they say, "You are going too far. You are mistreating these people." A judge determines that Delphine must sell all of her slaves to other owners because she is too violent. But being the manipulator that she was, she arranges that all of her family buy the slaves for her so she can get them back. After this, she is absolutely furious, and the torture would only get worse. Although the extent of horror would not be officially known until April 10th, 1834, when a massive fire is seen bellowing out of the mansion. We now know that the fire was purposely started by a 70-year-old slave cook who was chained to the stove. Really, this puts the horror that these people endured into perspective, since this woman was to the point that she would rather possibly burn alive while being chained to the stove than endure another day of torture. We can only assume that this was also a last-ditch effort to possibly expose the horrors that were going on behind the mansion's walls. As the fire continues to spread across the mansion, Delphine runs out to the street hysterical, begging people for help, as she's only concerned with removing her valuables, her jewelry, her artwork, her furniture. Although those on the street ignore her pleas because they know that she has slaves who are still locked in the house. When the crowd asks Delphine and her husband for the key to the slave quarters, they refuse. Thankfully, the crowd proceeds to go inside anyways, and eventually they break down the door to the slave quarters. Once the door busts open, they just stare in complete shock and horror. Inside Delphine's torture den, 7 slaves were discovered suspended by their necks with their limbs stretched and torn from one extremity to the other, and that their bodies were covered in a pattern of scars and cuts. Some people were fitted with spiked collars around their necks, and that one man had a large hole in his head that was infested with maggots. The same article would also state that the slaves were property of a demon that was masquerading as a woman, and that the people in this torture den were there for months. While another publication would state that Delphine's mask had finally been removed. Both editors of these publications had witnessed the events of this day, and they had also seen the starved and mutilated slaves. Although after all of this is discovered, she's still not arrested. In fact, the next day she swiftly leaves her charred mansion and takes a sailboat to Alabama. And then from there she goes to France. Meanwhile, the public is furious and they demand justice. A furious crowd forms around the charred remains of the mansion, and at this time they don't know that Delphine's not actually there anymore. At a time that was grossly divided by skin color and class, all people came together, and the crowd as a whole destroyed every piece of that mansion, every piece of furniture, every piece of artwork, the fine china. They brought it down to complete ruins. They did not stop until the roof and the walls were completely gutted and torn down. When it came to the victims themselves who were tortured, they were carried by stretchers to the mayor's office. And during my research, I read conflicting things. One source says that the slaves were given medical treatment, food, and water, while another source states that they were taken and put essentially on display so everybody could look at the horrific torture that was done to them. As weeks pass by, 2 of the mutilated slaves do die of their injuries. When the grounds of the mansion are searched, they discover more bodies that were either buried or hidden. Unlike what's portrayed in American Horror Story, Delphine never receives any real punishment, aside from just having a bad reputation. She would live the rest of her life in France, and today, a replica of the 1830s mansion stands on the grounds of where the original was. Follow along as I continue to unbox the other real people and places that have inspired the different American Horror Story seasons. Although we have a lot more to do for Coven. And if you enjoy this series and my content, please do me a favor and subscribe to my YouTube channel.